Hello, my name is Joshua Long, and today I want to talk about Dr. Anna Salter, a psychologist and author of many books on topics of sex offender rehabilitation, child victim therapy, and abuse prevention. And she's had a tremendous impact on the field, and I want to honor her efforts by documenting her key contributions. And to begin with, I went and read her dissertation from Harvard University in the program of clinical psychology. And I just assumed that when people do this work, that they start off being interested in child abuse prevention, and that's where she would have written her dissertation. But she actually had not studied it at all. She hadn't taken any classes on child abuse, and her dissertation is on hyperactivity among children. And it doesn't even mention child abuse at all. And I thought it was a great dissertation in hindsight, knowing how her work would progress. And then I saw something in there that stood out to me that is very interesting because in all of her books, they're so accessible that when you read them, you usually don't feel like you're reading a really dense, boring academic literature review. Now, she does review everyone else's research, but she almost explains it as she goes along in a way that it's accessible to a wider audience than just a literature dump, like so many academics do in order to be, I guess, more obscure, more and seemingly more profound. She doesn't do that. She keeps it as simple as possible. And she'll even put in her own personal experience, clinical experience, and occasionally some type of humorous episode that would, wake up the reader. And she even does that way back in 1977 in her dissertation. So I just wanted to read this one section where she's describing why some people did not want to participate in the study. And she says 34 parents refused to participate, 12 of them gave no explanation, 2 were concerned about confidentiality, 1 was too busy, and 1 family proved to be difficult to classify. The second attempt to reach the mother went as follows. A male voice answered the phone, said nothing to my request, but turned around and yelled, "It's the lady from Harvard." He turned to the phone. This is the butler. A woman came on the phone and said, without preamble, "I don't know what you can do about this boy. There's nothing you can do about him." The conversation continued in this rather one-sided way until I discovered the speaker was not the child's mother. She would, the lady thought, probably be back later. The lady did not identify herself, but did tell me her opinion was that it was okay to include the child in the study. Later phone calls yielded similar results. And I think that shows that so much social science research is based on surveys. And you might have a survey where only 20% of people respond, or maybe 80% respond, but why didn't the other 20% respond? And that's going to influence the generalizability of your results. And so few academics really bother to even consider that people's lives and their personalities and all these things that get in between the generalization of your survey results and how important your study is to you is kind of a joke to other people. And so here in her dissertation, she concludes that, and I thought it was funny. Now, she did publish some academic journal articles early in her career, and in 1985, she published 2. One of them was Treating Abusive Parents, and she recognizes that abusive parents are notoriously difficult to treat. This article suggests that responsibility for some therapeutic failures lies in the lack of applicability of insight-oriented therapies to the levels of ego development characteristic of physically abusive parents, meaning you can't use a one-size-fits-all solution to therapy. And if people recommend insight-oriented psychodynamic therapy, so I think that this model of child abuse that she discusses is important because it's so focused on the present-minded thoughts of the individual, what was going through their head at the time that they committed the act. And then that's going to show up later when she's talking about people who don't abuse their children physically, like discipline, but people who sexually abuse children. And she did therapy with sex offenders for most of her life. And I think that this focus on a CBT model rather than psychodynamic therapy and insight-oriented therapy shows up in her later work too. In 1985, she also published another article called Treating Abused Preschoolers. So now she's talking about the victims of abuse. She wrote a book chapter in 1992 called The Epidemiology of Child Sexual Abuse, And there's a great quote in there, and it says, "Older studies document clearly that sexual abuse was found in a quarter or more of females since the 1920s. The high prevalence figures raise intriguing questions. How is it that sexual abuse was so soundly ignored, both in public and professional circles, until the last 10 years, even though research on its ubiquitousness has been growing for decades? How is it today, with massive amounts of research supporting the existence of large numbers of sexually abused children, that the battle still continues over whether children reporting that abuse are making fictitious reports en masse? The answers to those questions will not be found in the numbers." So, at some point in her career, she realized that all the clients who were coming in to talk to her, a clinical sample, people who were suffering mental illness and seeking help, these people had large numbers of percentage of them had been sexually abused. And then she looks at the research and sees that huge numbers of people are sexually abused, to the point we don't even know how many, because people don't disclose it until later on when they end up in a therapist's office. They don't tell the police. They sometimes aren't believed when they do tell someone, so it doesn't show up in official records. But if a quarter of females, 25% of girls, are being sexually abused, what does that mean? And how could we possibly ignore this? Where have the therapists been all this time? Why do they blame the children for making fictitious reports? And that's going to be a big theme throughout her work, all the way up to the modern her most recent publication. So also in 1992, she published a response, and there was a back and forth among authors about the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome, and the idea that children should behave a certain way in order for us to be able to tell if they're lying or if they made it up later. And one of the things that people believed was that if a child was sexually abused, they should try to get away, and they should immediately disclose. They should make a report right away. So if a father sexually abuses his daughter, she should run to her mother immediately. If she's sexually abused at school, she should run to the principal and tell right then and there. And if she waits a week or a month or a year or 10 years, it means it didn't happen. But there's no reason to believe that every child is going to disclose in exactly the same way. And even if there was a percentage number, let's say 51% of kids report within a certain period of time, would that imply that the other 49% are lying? So Anna Salter just confronts this with pure logic and her own experience, knowing that people didn't disclose. The adults who came into her clinic reported being abused when they were kids and never told anyone, and had no incentive to lie to a therapist. And it's not like there's going to be any justice done 30 years later. So she said, "There is not a shred of positive evidence to suggest that the majority of sexually abused children disclose immediately after the abuse, nor even that they disclose in childhood at all." And that'll be a big thing later. In 1988, she published what is one of the first comprehensive and important textbooks, a practical guide on treating child sex offenders and victims. So step one, she's going to describe all the prior research. So this, for anyone who wants to study the development of the history of how child abuse is perceived by psychiatrists from Sigmund Freud all the way to 1988, this is the book that is the complete analysis of the history of child sex abuse. And then it gets into how to do therapy, which are the most effective forms of therapy for reducing the sexual abuse for perpetrators. Now, this is still controversial to this day. Does treatment work? What kinds of treatment work? What programs don't work? Who does it work for? Does it work for this group or that group? And people still talk about that today. But I think that she identified the characteristics of effective programs in 1988, and all of her recommendations still stand up today as being what, an extra, 37 years of research supports a lot of what she said here in 1988. So it shows that she knew what she was talking about. She's not just looking at statistics from a distance. She was a practitioner, and she could see what works and what doesn't, and then tied it into the preceding literature. And she mentions in here so many important topics that I want to read a couple of quotes. One is about the 2-week cure, sort of a sarcastic thing, where the guy comes in And after 2 weeks says, "Thank you, doc. That was great. I learned a lot. No, I don't think I need therapy anymore. Well, I'll never do that again. So long." Now, this is describing a situation where a man signed up for therapy and his victim told someone, and the family said, "Hey, we're not going to call the police. We just want you to get help." So he signed up for therapy. 2 weeks later, he quits therapy, and he didn't sign a disclosure agreement, so the family thinks he's still in therapy. Did it work? Was he cured? What do we mean when we say a program works? Did that in 2 weeks, did he learn enough skills that he's not going to do it again? And you got to think about this from the point of view that sex offenders are very rational in the way they try to reduce the likelihood of being caught. They choose their victims very carefully, and they plan it out, rationalize it, and then fantasize about it. So this is not something like, "Oh, you've convinced me that what I've done was illegal. Never thought of it that way before." So they're trying to manipulate the therapist so that they can get their certificate of completion and then get right back to business. Whether it's effective or not, whether the fear of getting caught is going to deter them, she didn't think so. She said this is hard work to try to undo the programming that these sex offenders have been through their whole lives, and to be constantly reinforced by the fact that they have many more victims than we know about, and they get away with it so much that it's foolish to think they're scared of getting caught again. And she brings up another point, which is that with these crimes, therapists should be mandatory reporters, and these people should be involved in the criminal justice system, because there is no other way to guarantee the safety of the community while treating sex offenders other than to have some legal control over them. Otherwise, one is counting on the offender's ability and willingness to control his behavior, which he has already explicitly demonstrated he is unable to do. So I think that that's another good point that still applies to therapy programs today. She brought up 7 issues that are important to address with child victims. The first is the perception of safety. And she recommends her whole career that one of the best ways to try to get children and adults who were victimized to really get the most out of therapy is for them to feel safe when they first start. And so to do a little hypothetical exercise where you tell them, think of a safe place. And sometimes the language of their thoughts doesn't even permit them to think of safety. They've never been safe. They're hypervigilant. And she'll say, well, think of a safe place where no one can get you, where no one could ever, you're just all alone and you're totally safe. And someone might say, I'm in a boat in the middle of the ocean and I can see in all directions and no one can get to me. Well, that might be step 1 before you can even get to the rest of the therapy. Number 2 is empowerment. Number 3, expression and ventilation of feelings, not holding back, not telling them they're not allowed to feel angry, not telling them something like how they should feel, or shaming or humiliating them for feeling the way that the therapist disagrees with, not telling them that they have to forgive immediately. Like the end goal of therapy is forgiveness. What if a child is really angry and they want to rip the head off a doll? Education about sexual offenses and sex education. So children who are being through the grooming process and the abuse are learning about how to behave. This is what adults do. The person will show them violent pornography or all kinds, just pornography that says this is normal. Now we're going to do this. And a child who can't tell the difference between being abused and regular, normal, consensual sex between adults is going to have a really difficult time throughout their life trying to sort that out. So it's important to tell them what is a sex offense, what is wrong, and then give them basic sex education of what it is that is appropriate and what conditions it's appropriate. Number 6 is assertiveness and communication skills, teaching the child how to say what they need to say in order to get their point across with other family members. And then number 7, the concepts of guilt in comparison to shame, trust, and ambivalence, and trying to get kids to understand their own emotions as they process through things. And I think what was really interesting is throughout her career, Anna Salter has brought up this one concept, which is that from an outsider's point of view, when you think about someone who's a victim or a victim who blames themselves, but she points out that this is actually empowering in a certain sense, that if you could say the reason I was abused is because of what I did, then you could say, I won't do that anymore. Or if it was because of the way I was dressed, I won't dress that way anymore. And it allows you to have some type of power in a situation where you were actually powerless, that it was the offender's choice that you were targeted and abused. It has nothing to do with what you were wearing or what you were doing. You were targeted by an adult. And so I think this quote really emphasizes this. A child has no sense of efficacy at all in regards to an untrustworthy adult, whereas the condition of deserving abuse is a form of efficacy. A child can at least imagine that she might change and thereby no longer be abused. This issue of helplessness and efficacy is perhaps one reason why so many rape victims have in the past insisted the rape was their own fault, precipitated by dress or action. And Dr. Salter, after that book was published, became one of the most prominent experts in the field. And she was highly sought after by workshops and training groups across the world. So she has at this point been to all 50 states and many other nations to talk about how to do therapy and why a lot of what was believed among therapists at the time might be wrong because of biases or shoddy work, bad interpretation of studies, or bad studies. And she talks about in such a great common sense way of, think about this. Should a child be scared whenever they see the person who abused them? Well, most people would say, yeah, they should be scared. After all, he's a predator. He hurt her. But what if there was an elaborate grooming process? And what if he had given her all kinds of gifts? And what if, this had gone on for years? And what if he tries to make the child feel bad for making the report? That it's more complicated than that. And I think that I've only seen one of her workshops, and I'll play a short clip from a video. But I just wanted to say that she's a great instructor, and it would have been great to have seen her perform one of these presentations, which sometimes go over 5 hours or multiple days in a row, in person, to be able to ask her questions. And so now think about her legacy, not just writing books and doing therapy, but training therapists to spread this information far and wide.
Then he got the kid in a chair, and the chair was a captain's chair that had arms like this, and he pulled his chair right up so he was knee to knee, and he got his hands on the arms of the chair, and he's got this 5-year-old leaning against the back of the chair. Remember, this is a guy he's disclosed abuse on, and he said, I'm very concerned about those things you've been saying about me. It was a dream, wasn't it? It was a dream, wasn't it? It was a dream. You know, if a non-offending spouse ever did that, they'd have lost custody, right? They'd have lost custody if they tried to intimidate and brainwash a child in that manner. The kid stiffened, used gaze aversion, backed up. He by no means was unaffected by that. She said this child has not been abused because, in her opinion, he wasn't afraid of the offender. I thought he actually was quite afraid of the offender, to tell you the honest truth. Anyway, she recommended that not only that the father get visitation, she recommended the father get custody because the mother had made up the report. The court went with it. The father got custody, and then, if you can believe this, she starts showing on the screen slides 2 years later of anal intercourse that the boy is still drawing on visitation with his mother. And she says, well, this mother is obviously still up to her old tricks because she's making up these drawings because this kid couldn't be drawing it because this kid isn't being sexually abused.
In 1995, she wrote another book called Transforming Trauma, A Guide to Understanding and Treating Adult Survivors of Child Sexual Abuse. It's one of the best books in this area that I've ever read, and in fact, it's my favorite book that Anna Salter has ever read. And just to give you an idea, when I read this book, I was so angry in the first half of the book because it describes how offenders choose their victims and hurt their victims and justify it to themselves as a build-up to explain why these adults who survived child abuse, they grew up and they have all these mental health problems, what was actually happening to them. You can't just say victim of sex offense because that's so vague, it doesn't even tell you what happened. So she has to describe those crimes. And it is so difficult to get through that I read one paragraph at a time, and it took me quite a long time to get through the first half of the book because I would be so angry thinking about it, of the injustice that these people could get away with these crimes, or that anyone would even choose to do these crimes to anybody, even to the ones who abused adults. And the excuses that they make is so baffling that it changes the way you think about everything related to sex crime victimization. I wish I could require this to be read by everyone who calls themselves a criminologist, who usually come at these issues from a sociological perspective with incredible bias, and a bias towards not punishing or stigmatizing people who commit these crimes. How could they possibly say something like that when these people, by their own admission, rationalize their behavior, think about it, plot, plan, hurt children, and enjoy hurting children? So this is a big wake-up call to anybody who took a bunch of sociology and criminology classes but never stepped over into the psychology department. There's a lot you can learn. So here's a couple of quotes from this book, actually several quotes in a row, because like I said, this was, I think, her most important book, although the one that came afterwards, Predators, is also very important. The entire category of regressed offender must be viewed with some suspicion because it is based on self-report and is very difficult to verify independently. Sex offenders sometimes use such categorization to deny responsibility and claim they are not real pedophiles. And this is really important, and all the sex offenders I ever talked to, they've always told me that they're not predators. And you're like, well, what do you mean? And they're like, well, I never jumped out of the bushes. Well, what did you do? Well, you lured a kid into your house to play video games and you sexually abused them. They don't call that being a predator because predators hide in the bushes. Then you talk to them and say, well, what kind of therapy are you taking? And they'll say, I'm in the sex offender treatment program, but I don't have to be there. I shouldn't be taking this class. Well, why? Well, because I'm not a pedophile. Well, you sexually abused a prepubescent child. How could you do that and not be a pedophile? Well, not technically, they're not a pedophile. It was just an opportunity kind of thing. And it just kind of blows your mind that the rationalizations to deny responsibility is actually a whole category of sex offenders that is promoted by psychologists to this day. They're like, oh yeah, he abused a bunch of kids, but he's not a pedophile. He's regressed, or situational, or opportunistic. And I think Anna Salter is the only person who's ever said, you know, this is self-report. You think they don't tell lies? You think they're not trying to, get away from this stigma, this label that could be an accurate label, but it's one that they don't want to accept because it would imply responsibility. And then another quote is, sometimes they claim that offenses just happen and blame them on nothing at all. Unfortunately, such rationalizations are frequently believed. A Wisconsin judge sentenced a 24-year-old man to 3 years probation after he was found guilty of first-degree sexual assault on a 5-year-old girl, commenting that, I am satisfied that we have an unusually sexually promiscuous young lady, and that this man just did not know enough to knock off her advances. Wow. And I'm glad that Anna Salter is willing to put discussion of real-life cases of extremely lenient sentences that blame the victim. To refer to a 5-year-old girl as a unusually sexually promiscuous young lady is to completely throw the law in the trash. To take what is written in the law, that this is a crime against a child, and throw it away just because he thinks that 5-year-old is promiscuous. It sounds like the judge needs to be investigated, in my opinion. Sexual offending is not an accident that happens to offenders. It is not an illness that descends on them and then mysteriously passes. It is not a problem that they eventually solve. If not actually an addiction, it is a compulsive behavior that does not necessarily get better with time or with promises to do better. Religion is used more often to evade treatment than to support it. Remorse may interrupt the pattern, but rarely controls it. Nothing cures it. That's a quote that should be in every book and every article on sex offender treatment programs because it puts it in perspective. If someone apologizes and promises not to do it again, does that what kind of currency is that in our legal system? Although learning how sex offenders think and how they behave is disheartening and dismaying, nevertheless, the best protection against sexual abuse is understanding it. Sex offenders get away with far too much, far too often, because the average layperson and far too many clinicians do not know enough about sexual assault to avoid being conned. Sexual abuse is not an accident. It does not just happen. It is not typically an impulsive act. It is a series of interlinking thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that are highly compulsive. It will not go away on its own. It is not easy to change, and it can never be cured, only controlled. For the adult survivor, life can be an unpredictable emotional roller coaster where the dips occur without warning and seemingly without reason. Many survivors, even those without PTSD, respond by trying to avoid any possible reminders of the abuse and wind up with impoverished lives in which they are, even so, still not safe. A phrase used by a friend, a certain position in lovemaking, the odor of a pipe, Sunday morning, a 1950s car, blue suits with white shirts, any of these triggers could cause the adult survivor to have an overwhelming rush of helplessness, despair, or even terror. Worse still, the affective flashback may be even more general stimuli. Men in general, sex of any sort, intimacy of any kind. It is like walking through a minefield in the dark, usually without even the sanity-making knowledge that one is in a minefield. Child sexual abuse is rarely physically violent, but it is always emotionally violent and marked by destruction of trust and by betrayal of intimacy. The intimacy is typically of a heightened and enhanced sort, built carefully by offenders, for whom the child's love is both a gatehouse of access and a guard post against disclosure. Child molesters are very professional at what they do, bragged the offender in Chapter 2 as he revealed his modus operandi for increasing trust in children. When you get their trust, that's when the child becomes vulnerable and you can molest the child. It is ironic that sex offenders, who mean only harm, sometimes work harder to develop intimacy and trust with children than anyone else in the child's environment. One great thing about this book is it compares the thought process of the perpetrator to the thought process of the victim and shows that whether through grooming, indoctrination, or just the nature of the act, and the philosophy of believing that this is the way it is, perpetrators and victims agree on some things. So for example, the perpetrator says, it's not his fault, it's her fault. And the victim agrees, it was my fault. The perpetrator says, she didn't stop me. And the victim says, I didn't do enough to stop him. The perpetrator says, I couldn't control myself. The victim says he couldn't help it. The perpetrator says, she should just forget about it and move on. The victim says, I should just forget about it and move on. The perpetrator says, she should just forgive me. And the victim says, she should just forgive him. But they do disagree on other things. For example, the perpetrator, being narcissistic, grandiose, and entitled, says he deserves it. What does the victim think about deserving and entitlement? The victim thinks, I'm nothing, I don't deserve to be happy, I don't deserve anything good in my life. The perpetrator says, I can't control myself, which Anna Salter notes is really should be read, I won't control myself. But the victim says that she should have done something to stop him. And so she should have controlled him rather than him controlling himself. Interesting how that overlaps with a lot of batterers intervention, where wife batterers will say, I've got a hot temper. And the wife says, well, it's just the way he is. He's really stressed out. He can't control himself. Victims blame themselves. Perpetrators blame their victims. The perpetrator will take a victim stance, a pity party. This is horrible. Everything bad happens to me. Why do I get in trouble? Whereas the victim blames themselves. They're not grandstanding. They're not taking, this victimhood mantle as some way of getting attention. Most of them are ashamed and horrified by what happened, and they bury it deep down inside for decades. So the idea that victims just want attention is very foolish. It shows a complete lack of understanding of how these crimes work. Perpetrators often have super optimism that they can get away with their crimes and they'll get away with everything and it's all going to work out for the best. And that ties back to the narcissism, the control of the environment. They're in charge. They can get away with anything. And maybe they have gotten away with so much that if they get caught for one thing, it's still a joke to them. But the victim might develop a trauma-based worldview where bad things are going to happen. Bad things happen in the past, they're going to happen again. And she describes some really heartbreaking stories in her book about people who are just completely given up on life. The perpetrator externalizes blame, the victim internalizes blame. Now, one thing that she talks about in this book and brings up many times is how we have different worldviews. One person looks at a sex crime and they try to fit that into a just world philosophy that, well, we live in a just world, and so if something bad happened, it must be because the victim deserved it. Or maybe it's not that bad, the victim will get over it. Or, there's not bad predators out there seeking victims. Those are misunderstood people who have, capitalism causes stress, and they're making excuses for everyone. Some people also completely downplay or ignore the reality of these crimes, and she refers to these people as having a Pollyanna optimism, like Pollyanna, the girl who was always trying to put a smile on everybody's face and look at the bright side, look at the silver lining. And that's kind of annoying to people who've been victimized or who have dealt with these types of abuse to the point you develop a pessimistic view of the world. Pessimistic or realistic, depends on who's labeling who. But this Pollyanna optimism of non victims ignores the horrible consequences of sexual abuse. Victims are probably going to develop some type of depression, and it could be very severe, it could be chronic. Anxiety, fear, they may even be re-victimized many times, which further amplifies this cycle of depression, justifying their belief in that the world is a traumatic and horrible place. She describes at great length affective flashbacks, so emotional flashbacks, not necessarily waking up in the middle of the night and thinking that you're being abused and seeing a hallucination of somebody in the room or something like that, but an emotional flashback where you might smell perfume or smell cologne, or some small thing reminds you of the abuse, but cognitively you don't even recognize the association. You just get this overwhelming emotional despair because of that trigger, because of that stimuli. And she describes that at great length in this book. She describes the trauma-based worldview as being a consequence of abuse, and she says it's a belief that the world is unsafe and unpredictable. Such a view may be so negative and pessimistic that it precludes all hope. Post-traumatic stress disorder, obviously, she goes in depth on that. She talks about how the victim may also have a just world philosophy they're trying to fit their abuse into, and so they blame themselves because of that. That the reason this happened isn't because we live in a bad world, it's because I did something that deserved this. Sort of like Candide. It's the best of all possible worlds, so how do you explain all this trauma and horror? Well, it must be for the best. And then some of them accept a fatalistic degree of hopelessness, kind of like learned helplessness, where animals are shocked and in an inescapable shock in a cage, and they learn to give up and pretty much become objects of further victimization throughout their life because they don't take steps to prevent it or to stand up for themselves. And then the 3Ds, denial, to the point that the victim's own children may be abused by the same person. So, for example, a woman is abused by her father. She denies that it happened. And then she thinks that she's crazy. I must be making it up. My father wouldn't do that. And then when she has children of her own, she lets her father babysit because he's a grandpa and he's the good guy and he didn't do anything. And then he abuses the grandchild too. And now the mother blames herself for not admitting what had happened to her. Some of this denial is full amnesia, denying that something happened even if the perpetrator, confessed. Distraction, working so much, staying so busy that you don't give yourself time to think. And, maybe there's a lot of workaholics out there, people who push themselves to the limit because they don't want to slow down. If you took a day off, you would, fall into despair. And then she describes dissociation, which I thought that at the time, 1995, is a time when dissociative identity disorder and a lot of these things were being strongly opposed. There was a lot of controversy and pushback on how do you identify it, how do you measure the symptoms, how reliable and valid is the diagnosis. And she talks about it in this book as trying to go somewhere else in your own mind during the abuse or when you're thinking of the abuse. And so she describes how a woman, be an adult, might be having sex with her husband, and she just goes mentally somewhere else. and her husband complains that it's like she's not even in the room with him. But she also describes dissociation as a way during the abuse itself. It was a learned way of not being in the room while it's happening. So you're being sexually abused and you're looking out the window and thinking about what's outside. And the sadistic abuser doesn't like that. He wants you to think about the abuse, and so he shuts the window so that you can't see outside. You have to focus on the pain. And then how do people deal with this? How do they medicate the pain, the psychological pain? Well, drugs and alcohol, obviously. That's one thing that is going to be a huge issue for many of these people. Is you can escape with drugs and alcohol, which creates all kinds of other problems in your life and doesn't solve the underlying issue. She talks about self-mutilation and all the different reasons that might, cutting your arms and legs might provoke endorphins, or maybe it's a distraction, or maybe it's a way of punishing yourself because you blame yourself so much. But the ultimate consequence of all this could be suicidality or actual completed suicides. So the Pollyanna optimists out there, and in my profession, the sociologists who talk about this all the time, have to ignore most of this to even get to the point where they could talk about destigmatizing abuse, and destigmatizing punishment and not punishing people. And I might record a long video with quotes from people to prove to you that there are an awful lot of sociologists out there who say that society has to be nice and use nice words in order to talk about these crimes so that we don't make the offender feel bad about himself. And I call that, as a pretty big symptom for the Pollyanna people. One great thing about her books is that she's a historian of the development of our current understanding of sex crimes. And there's always been multiple ways of looking at these behaviors. One is that it's a morally repulsive crime that hurts victims. And on the other hand, what's the big deal? Why are you stigmatizing pedophiles? Why are you blaming him for this abuse when it's the child's fault? Or maybe the child benefits from it. And these different views have been held by psychiatrists and psychologists for over 100 years. And I would consider Anna Salter to be the historian who's documented this for those of us who are just, getting into the research. If I told you to go and read all the research you can on sex offender treatment and rehabilitation, you're going to start in the, most recent 20 years of research. You'll get in an online library. You'll read hundreds, thousands of articles on the subject. Are you really going to go back to Sigmund Freud? Are you going to go all the way back to the 1920s? Well, Dr. Salter read 100 years worth of research on this and found some quotes that are astounding in the how far people are willing to go in order to deflect blame from the perpetrator to the victim. Carl Abraham, a psychiatrist friend of Sigmund Freud, wrote, "In a great number of cases, the trauma was desired by the child unconsciously, and we have to recognize it as a form of infantile sexual activity." Loretta Bender wrote, "Children derive fundamental satisfaction from the relationship. They do not completely deserve the cloak of innocence with which they have been endowed by moralists, social reformers, and legislatures. The child was the actual seducer rather than the one seduced." Alfred Kinsey wrote, "Some of the more experienced students of juvenile problems have come to believe that the emotional reactions of the parents, police officers, and other adults who discover that the child has such a contact may disturb the child more seriously than the sexual contacts themselves." Revich and Weiss stated flatly that the majority of pedophiles are harmless individuals and their victims are usually known to be aggressive and seductive children. Their position is clear. The child victim is aggressive and seductive and often induces the adult offender to commit the offense. While admitting that they rarely interviewed the victims and relied almost entirely on the word of the offenders, nonetheless they concluded, "The precocious and aggressive children quickly sense the infantile characteristics of the pedophile and very soon lose the awe of adult authority and treat him as if he were one of them. The pedophile will complain that the children annoy him, that they followed him into the bathroom when he had to urinate, and that they exploited him through accepting his gifts and money, which he allegedly distributed just because of friendly feelings or in order to help a deprived child." Moore objected to the view, current in some quarters, that offenders are responsible for sexual assaults against children. There is a cultural assumption, if not a conspiracy, to look at and present the phenomenon of pedophilia in a way that excludes its treatment as an interaction phenomenon. It is difficult to understand why this should be, although there can be no doubt about the level of anxiety such incidents arouse in adults. This anxiety and the demonology to which it gives rise is not accounted for by the pedophilic incidents themselves. Judith Levine supports lowering the age of consent in America to 12 years old, and she wrote in 2002, "Teens often seek out sex with older people, and they do so for understandable reasons. An older person makes them feel sexy and grown up, protected and special. Often the sex is better than it would be with a peer who has as little skill as they do. For some teens, a romance with an older person can feel more like salvation than victimization." Anna Salter has read their work, quoted them, not taking them out of context, and just stated flatly, they're wrong. They're wrong. They don't even interview the child victims. They're talking to pedophiles. They're talking to the abusers. And when they do, they take the pedophile side over the child. They will identify some little thing about the kid or their personality or the way they're behaving and say, that's evidence the kid is a liar, or that the kid is precocious, or the kid is the aggressor. And even if the child was to behave in a way that would be symptomatic of abuse, such as being depressed or anxious or something like that, they would use that as a character flaw to once again reinforce that the offender is the good guy and the child is to blame. So if you think that that's just limited to a fringe, I think you should read all of her books, and she'll walk you through the history of that. One person that she was particularly upset by his influence is Richard Gardner, a psychologist who tried to get this thing called parental alienation syndrome included in the DSM, and it never was because there's no evidence to support it. And essentially the idea is that every time a child is making a report against their father, and the mother seeks a divorce, the mother is coaching the child to say that they were sexually abused in order to alienate them from the father, and that is a form of child abuse. And therefore, the child should be given to the father with full custody. So the abusing father is the one who's going to be in sole charge of the child, and the mother won't be able to protect them. This can result in horrible injustice in the courtroom, because this guy was apparently very persuasive. It sounds ridiculous to people who aren't part of that ideology, but when you're looking for someone to articulate your points to help sex offenders have further access to children, this was the guy to go to. And Anna Salter, in her most recent book in 2025, Confronting Malice, she said, "It is frustrating beyond belief to see such biased and shoddy work and have court after court give it credence. The cost to children who dare to disclose abuse once the offender is out of the house is incalculable. When I sent this book to an editor for review, she said the theory sounded insane and wanted to know what era it was popular in. This era. Parental alienation is popular to this day in a multitude of U.S. courts. People believe what they choose to believe, and this can mean disregarding a wide chorus of professionals who are appalled by the acceptance of this theory." So just remember, trust the experts, but you get to pick your expert. Ralph Unterweger was a minister of divinity and had a Ph.D. in psychology, and he was paid a lot of money to go and testify in court cases saying that children were liars and that there were false allegations. And he would cite a bunch of research, and he wrote a book called Accusations of Child Sexual Abuse with Helinda Wakefield. And this man made a lot of money, started an organization, and it was for fathers who were and mothers, anyone who was accused of sexually abusing a child, to say that lots of other children are liars, therefore this child might be lying. And he would go and testify and get cases thrown out of court. He even traveled to Australia at one point, and 60 Minutes in Australia ran a full expose of Mr. Unterweger and his work, and found that he didn't even interview the children. He just went and testified and said a bunch of stuff that was not justified by the research that he claimed to be citing. Well, then they interviewed Anna Salter and asked her, "What do you think about this guy?" And she goes step by step with a big binder full of all the studies he claims to cite and explains why he's wrong, why he's interpreting these studies wrong, and that his testimony should never have been used in a court of law, especially not in a case where a man, Mr. Bubbles, was sexually abusing lots of children. So I'm going to play a clip from this so you can see how Anna Salter talks about the case, and then I'll explain what happened afterwards.
You'll remember police listed 17 young victims, and more than 50 criminal charges were eventually laid. But when the Mr. Bubbles case went to court, not one of the children was called to give evidence. The charges were thrown out, and Tony Derren was set free. One of the key Derren witnesses was a hired gun from the United States, a psychologist named Ralph Underwager, who says he's an expert in child sexual abuse. He testified that the children's evidence had been contaminated and that they were too young to know what the truth was. But just what is Mr. Underwager's expertise? And how much respect does he command in American courts? We went there to find out. And we should warn that at times in this report, the language has to be quite explicit.
You're a bastard.
No, I'm not.
You're a bastard.
This is Ralph Underwager, psychologist. He was paid $25,000 and gave crucial evidence in favour of Tony Derren. Evidence which helped Derren walk free.
Your people can leave now. You go out the door now.
When we wanted to question Mr. Underwager about his involvement in the Bubbles case, the questions got too harsh.
You go out the door now.
He's investigated Underwager for the past 3 years.
Underwager is presented as a scientific observer, when in fact, from our perspective, more often than not, he's there as an advocate.
And anything but independent.
Anything but.
Well, he is someone who makes his living going around the country and testifying against children in child sexual abuse cases. He says the same thing in essentially every case, which is every...
And Anna Salter knows what she's talking about. A Ph.D. from Harvard and a master's degree in early childhood. She says young children can be believed.
I mean, this is consistent with the literature. If you look at what is the best legal textbook in the country today on children as witnesses, Child Witness Theory and Practice, John Meyer says clearly children as young as 3 can comprehend the duty to tell the truth.
And this man is a highly respected legal scholar in America.
I think he's fairly clearly the chief leading scholar on child sexual abuse in the country.
6 American states have given Dr. Salter a grant to check Underwager's methods in court. And what did she find?
That he isn't accurate. That what he says in court does not necessarily fairly represent the literature.
He distorts the facts.
Frequently. Sometimes he quotes specific studies, and he's frequently wrong about what the studies say.
So we thought we'd get Dr. Salter to analyse the evidence Underwager gave under oath at the Mr. Bubbles hearing, where he testified his qualifications had never been questioned. But in an American case, the Swan case, this is what the court said about Ralph Underwager.
The court remains convinced the psychologist did not have the qualifications to testify as a doctor. The trial court ruled that the psychologist's proposed testimony was not proper because there was no indication that the results of the doctor's work had been accepted in the scientific community.
Now, the second incident in the Mr. Bubbles case was where Underwager said that 90% of accusations against child molesters are wrong. Now, is that backed up scientifically?
No, that's gobbledygook. I don't know of any study that would support that.
There is a major German study that was done and reported in 1983, and a major finding is that for children who have been abused, the impact of adult behaviors toward actually abused children is more traumatic and does more harm to the children than the abuse itself.
Is that right?
Yes.
What
Germans-
report's this?
It's Bauermann, 1983. In German, it's Sexualität, Gewalt und psychische Folgung.
And what did Baumann really say?
Well, I'm afraid what it said was,
Of the reported sexual contacts, half of the sexual victims claimed that the sexual act itself to be the main cause of injury, 1/3 the behavior of the suspect, and 1/10 each the behavior of relatives, friends, or the police. In other words, instead of saying that the majority of children were harmed by the system, they said that it was a very small minority.
Mr. Underweger, I have the Bauman report in front of me.
Yes, sir.
It's directly opposite to what you just said.
No, I don't believe it is at all. I'm saying, I didn't say that that's what happens in every case.
No, but you said the majority of cases.
No, I don't believe I did.
Over the past couple of years, courts across America have begun saying no to Underweger, that his expert evidence is unreliable.
Ralph Underweger was so angry that 60 Minutes exposed him, and that Anna Salter had dared to disagree with him, that he sued Anna Salter. He filed a lawsuit against her. He tried to file ethics complaints against her to get her in trouble. And this is a guy who, it was really extreme overreaction to someone who said, you're wrong, your citations are wrong, you're reading things wrong. To respond with such an aggressive backlash actually took years and years in the legal system in order for Anna Salter to defend her career. And she wrote about this in an article in 1998 called Confessions of a Whistleblower, Lessons Learned. And she wrote, in 1988, I began a report on the accuracy of expert testimony in child sexual abuse cases utilizing Ralph Underweger and Halida Wakefield as a case study. In response, Underweger and Wakefield began a campaign of harassment and intimidation. Then she wrote, I expected a vigorous counterattack from Underweger and Wakefield, but I never expected taped phone calls, private detectives, systematic lying, frivolous ethics charges, bogus lawsuits, groundless charges of laundering grant monies, and so forth. In musing on all that occurred in the course of several years of harassment, the error I decided I made, and others frequently make, is to assume that we are all academics trying to sort out intellectual issues. The False Memory Syndrome Foundation is a political organization composed primarily of individuals who have been accused of child sexual abuse and those who support and defend them, sometimes for considerable sums. Such people are not going to be swayed by the research. So if you think that all these people with their Ph.D.s in psychology are all academics who are going to abide by the process and weigh evidence and argue back and forth in a professional debate, you are naive. There are some people who have a very strong interest in protecting their reputations, and they will sue the hell out of you. The good news is that the court found no evidence of malice in Dr. Salter's critique of Underweger and Wakefield's claims. They said, Underweger and Wakefield cannot, simply by filing suit and crying character assassination, silence those who hold divergent views, no matter how adverse those views may be to plaintiffs' interests. Scientific controversies must be settled by the methods of science rather than by the methods of litigation. So, Anna Salter won. Now, Anna Salter is probably most famous today for conducting interviews with sex offenders, people who she refers to as child molesters, then a group of psychopaths, and a group of sadists. And she describes the differences in the methods of how they get children, how they abuse kids, how they get away with their crimes, and how they perceive their crimes. It is one of the most amazing contributions to sex offender research to listen to them and see how they're talking about these crimes face to face with their therapist. And to have gotten permission to record them, it gives us an inside view that most people never get. You know, even when I do interviews in prisons, I'm not a therapist, and these, I don't get this level of discussion and disclosure. So what happened was she sells these videos. They were VHS originally, then DVDs, and now you can watch them on Vimeo. You go to her website and you can purchase it. And but someone got a hold of these and uploaded them to YouTube. And then they got sliced and diced and put all over social media on TikTok and places. Now, the good news is lots of people have seen this and they know that these people exist. A sadist who talks about hurting children because it was sexually arousing to hear them cry. I think that as disturbing and horrible as that is, it's extremely important for the naive people in society to recognize that these people exist. So that's a great service. The bad news is, by chopping these up and not seeing the full video, you don't get to see Anna Salter talking in between to describe what's happening and why they said this and how they're still deceiving, even when they admit to all these crimes and these motives, that it's even worse than you thought. They're still deceiving you by admitting, like, for example, I interviewed a guy who said that his victim was 11 years old. Well, she was actually 9. But I was still outraged that she was 11. You know, it's like in their mind, by admitting 80% of what happened, they can avoid the other part, which is really bad, and they know it's bad. And so she's able to talk about this and the deceptive techniques and how she's able to, even in a short interview, to get them to contradict themselves and admit a little more and a little more. Great for anyone who wants to study sex offenders, psychopathy, sadism, and especially deception. And it is highly disturbing material. I am not going to play those videos for 2 reasons. One, they're copyrighted. And the other reason is they're already all over YouTube, and you could go and watch some of them. But like I said, a lot of it's out of context. But I am going to play one short video, and this is Dr. Salter herself talking about why she made these videos. And in her own words, she can explain why this is so important.
I'm aware how disturbing this film is. I made it because I've seen children report acts of sadistic abuse and not be believed because the listener refused to believe that such things happen. It's easier to deny malevolence than it is to face it. But we have no hope of detecting and stopping this kind of behavior if we don't learn something about it. I made this film in the hopes that the next victim won't report 6 or 7 times as Gerald's victim did and still not be believed.
Now, Dr. Salter, in one of her fiction books and then one of her nonfiction books, she describes how when she talks to these people, sometimes she gets a really creepy feeling. And they're talking about how they take advantage of people's Christian faith or their good nature and their trusting, and how people would sexually abuse a child in the back seat of a car while their parents are in the front seat of the car. And that for them, this was a game. How can they manipulate? How far can they push this manipulation? And for them, they got a joy, a delight when they dupe people. And for them, the emotional pain of betrayal is actually sometimes the whole point of all this. And she compares some of these people to an octopus changing colors. And she said she saw a video of a cuttlefish or an octopus changing colors and trying to match a checkerboard, probably similar to this video I'm showing you now. And it's changing color. Is it using its eyes to look at the checkerboard? And then it's flexing its muscles to change its color? Like, there's no human analog to that. And so in a way, it's fascinating because it's so alien. Now, compare this to someone, imagine Anna Salter gets out of a prison and she goes back home and she sits down and she just got through talking to a guy who sexually abuses children in a church. And how he has this big smile on his face and he's laughing at the fact that he's able to deceive others. And she knows when he gets out, he's going to do it again because he loves the thrill of the hunt. And he blends in. He looks so non-threatening. He's got a big smile. And then she watches a video with this octopus changing color, and the word that she used twice is disquieting. That there's something disquieting about it. That these people can blend in such a way, and it's not perfect blending in. There's something missing. And that human element, that thing that makes them understandable to a person who's not a sadist, not a psychopath, who doesn't want to go around conning and deceiving and hurting people for the pleasure it gives them, is so hard for us to understand. It's like trying to think, how does an octopus change its color? There's no human analog. I thought that was a great point she made. The book she's probably most famous for is her 2003 book, Predators, Pedophiles, Rapists, and Other Sex Offenders: Who They Are, How They Operate, and How We Can Protect Ourselves and Our Children. And what's great about this book is it's so accessible. Now, the other books, like I said, are written in a way that's got a a whole lot of research literature, but it doesn't bog itself down with excessive erudite terminology. She's not trying to impress anybody that she's a Harvard psychologist. That's obvious that she's the expert in her field. She doesn't have to use big words. That's usually a sign that somebody's got something to prove. This book is specifically written for the public. Now, you're taking your kid to a soccer practice. You're going to drop him off. Is the coach reliable? How can you trust him? Well, what if the greatest expert in the world, who's interviewed hundreds of these guys, knows them better than anybody else in the world, has them on video, has them on polygraph machines, and has interviewed them, and they've written sexual autobiographies of everything they've ever done, and she can't tell when they're lying? She can't spot a difference between them and other people. And that's the disquieting part. The camouflage is too good. She can't tell when somebody is going to abuse a kid, so she can't drop her kid off at soccer practice. What does that mean for you as a parent? This book, I think, is the perfect antidote to a lot of research that's coming out lately on free-range kids and coddling children and helicopter parents, and saying, well, the number of kids who are abused is so low that we don't have to worry about it anymore. And so you should let your children take candy from registered sex offenders. If you're interested, I'll make another video on those people. I'll put a comment below, and if you hit like, if I get 10 likes, I'll make a video on the people who think that you shouldn't protect your kids. But, just want to make sure there's an audience for that. Well, my antidote for that is read this book, because it's lessons that are very important today and will probably always be important, because these crimes have happened forever. And if there's a fluctuation in trends up and down, it's probably because of guardianship, reducing opportunities, deflecting these people. So when it comes to deception, she has a quote in there. She says, "A double life is prevalent among all types of sex offenders. The front that offenders typically offer to the outside world is usually a good person, someone who the community believes has a good character and who would never do such a thing. Sometimes, if the molestations and rapes are occurring outside the home, they even portray the same image to their family. Psychopaths are misread over and over because the average person expects those who betray us to have the decency to feel bad about it. It is a sad and dangerous expectation. Instead of feeling remorse over deceiving others, psychopaths feel what is termed duping delight, a kind of joy and almost childlike delight in duping other people. The average person misreads the joy of predation as the guilelessness of innocence. After all, there is no gaze aversion, no nervous mannerisms. Seems as though the guy is pretty straight. Why, he looked me right in the eye. Sure he did. And the clear conscience and the lack of personal distress were genuine. In fact, look closely and you will see the same joy the professional football player has when he spikes the ball in the end zone, or the exuberance a boxer has when he raises both hands over a senseless opponent. It is the joy of winning, nothing more, nothing less. The difference is that anyone entering the ring or walking into the field knows a game is going on and what the rules are. In life, psychopaths are playing a different game with a different rule book from the rest of us. Here's another quote. She said, "Normal, healthy people distort reality to create a kinder, gentler world than actually exists. Such distortions work in our favor most of the time and make people happier, healthier, and more effective. Hope is a gift, and if it has a dark side, on some it seems likely that it gives more than it takes. Life would surely provide a hard road to hoe without it. But violent and sexual predation are not small problems, and they extract a fearful toll." Once again, the just world theory being applied to all of us suckers in the world, all of us trusting, naive, innocent people who believe in a just world and we have a Pollyanna outlook on life and everything's going to be just fine. And then you find out that that soccer coach was probably not the guy you should have had watching your children. However, she doesn't go overboard. Now, there's a big debate where the people in academia think they're so much smarter than the public, and they're always downplaying crimes and saying that the panic is a moral panic, or it's a hysteria, paranoia. Even one guy says that that parents fetishize safety by trying to protect their kids. And I consider this to be extremely insulting from the academy. They really don't understand how people really think. If anything, there's a lot of naivete out there, and people are letting their kids do things that's putting them in danger. And they might be teaching them the wrong things or having them look in the wrong areas for danger, sure. But the disconnect between the academy and the public is seen in the phrase academic. When someone in the academy says, "Oh, it's very academic," what they mean that's a good thing. It's very rigorous. It's very scientific. When the public use the word academic, they mean it as meaningless. Oh, that's just an academic issue. It's a nothing. It's worthless. So like the disconnect is really extreme. And where is Anna Salter on that spectrum? Does she think that we should lock our children up and never let them go anywhere? And you can imagine what it must be like to go to a prison and interview psychopaths and sadists and then go home and have to decide, what do you do to protect your family? It would be very easy for someone to go too far and deprive their children of opportunities to learn and have fun. But she doesn't say that because she's smart and she's not a stereotype of these moral panickers that the academy impose on anyone who disagrees with them. They assume that you're a moral panicker. Anna Salter says, you should assume every coach, every priest, every teacher is not likely to be a sexual predator, but that one of them could be, and that you will not know if he is. Given that we cannot detect child molesters or rapists with any consistency, we must pay attention to ways of deflecting any potential offenders from getting access to us or our children. Particularly, we must consider paying attention to probabilities and avoid high-risk situations. For any given situation, we must weigh the odds. Now, it creates ambiguity. It's not as clear-cut as people saying, oh, things are safer today than they've been since the 90s. Well, what does that mean? What if the risk was really high in the 90s and it's still high today? Just because it went down doesn't mean it's not going to go up. We could argue the weighing the odds. And it creates this vague sense of unease. So in practical terms, what does she say? She says, I do not recommend dropping children off at sports practices and extracurricular activities if you can help it, at least not at young ages. I do not recommend sending them on overnight trips with their coaches or other youth activity leaders without going along. In elementary and middle school, parents can go with their children to the school sock hop, to the community sports practices, to the games. You are not busy. You can't afford to be. That's the excuse everyone says, I'm so busy, I had to drop my kid off. No one is busier than Anna Salter. Having read her work, it took me years to get through all her work. How long did it take her to research and write it? She's one of the busiest people in the world. If she's not too busy, you're not too busy. And you can't afford to be too busy. This afternoon, I took my daughter to a soccer practice. There were 10 8-year-old girls, 2 male coaches, and only 2 parents there. 8 years old is the average age when sexual abuse starts for girls. Only 2 parents of these girls would know if there were typical signs of grooming, if girls were being touched unnecessarily and inappropriately, if one or more of them was being singled out for special favors, if one was taken away from us, the rest of the group for a special time. Only 2 of us. There is a second gain from being present. A parent who is constantly attending his or her child's extracurricular activities has a less vulnerable child. They do not have a child who is easy to groom because the child is already getting attention that he or she needs. It is hard to substitute for someone who is there, difficult to warm into a child's affections if she or he has active and involved parents. And it is a signal, too, to pedophiles that you are watching. I do not find that most pedophiles are looking for a challenge. Most are looking for an easy target. In my profession, we would call that routine activity theory, which is that there are motivated offenders and you don't know who they are. You don't know how they got motivated. You don't know how to resolve all their personal issues. You can't reduce all the strain in their life and their social learning history. They're just motivated and they're out there. And you have suitable targets, children. Well, the only thing that's going to stop them when they come in contact with that suitable target is a capable guardian. So pretty simple, like criminology is not as advanced as psychology, but that's 3 things right there. The motivated offender, the suitable target, and the lack of a capable guardian. So guard your children. Is there a way to do that while balancing your kid's need to be free range without being like this derogatory, insulting kind of academic who mocks the public concern? Well, sure. And Anna Salter finds the balance. She says, whenever possible, it is wise to deflect possible abuse. In other words, be there and supervise your child or support organizations that believe in avoiding situations where sexual abuse is possible. Above all, offenders need opportunities to get to know your child, to gain his or her trust, and finally, they need time and a place to abuse them. No opportunity, no abuse. Although the odds are very low that you will be attacked by a stranger in your home, or that your child will be one of the very few abducted by non-family members each year, if you're that one, you really don't care what the odds were. As for my decisions, look for me at basketball practice, on the soccer field, at Little League. I'm the woman sitting over there on the lawn chair with the baseball cap, the one at every practice, every game. I'm the one volunteering to help chaperone the overnights. I'm the parent whose children are in day camp, not overnight. If I do my job right, my children's lives will be filled with so many opportunities and interests, they will not even notice what they're missing. The only one who will notice is that friendly, smiling, affable man with a secret life. The one who's waiting for an opportunity that will never come.
We know that it is a massive problem. Now, many sex offenders commit a few offenses, and some commit an astronomical number of offenses. Abel has estimated that 5% of the sex offenders commit 70% of the crimes.
My goodness. Why is that?
Because they're high-risk offenders. They're serial pedophiles or serial rapists and so forth.
How do they get away with it? How can they do so many?
I spoke to a man who got away with, he estimated, 1,250. He was very personable. He was middle class. He worked as an athletic director in a middle school, and he molested kids for 20 years. Now, over the course of those years, several times kids told their parents, and in each case, until the last one, their parents said, "There must be some mistake here. John is a good man. John loves you. John wouldn't do anything like that. There must be some mistake."
So they thought their kid was lying?
They thought their kid was lying or confused. I don't really know what excuses parents make for not taking it seriously. But when I go into prisons and interview offenders, this kind of offender, the white middle-class professional offender, they all told me of incidents where they had gotten away with it. And many get grandiose after a while because even when they're caught, nothing happens. And the message I'd like to get across to the community is work on deflection, not detection. You are not going to detect them, so you have to decrease the opportunities for them to offend.
So in order to summarize these first 3 nonfiction books of hers, I would say that treating sex offenders and victims is primarily focused on rehabilitating sex offenders. So it's a great historical bookmark for summarizing all the research on sex offender treatment up till 1988. And it still applies for most of the programs after that, probably because of the big influence it had on programs since then. So that's that. When I read that book, that's what I'm looking for. Transforming Trauma is about victim recovery for adult survivors, but it talks about offenders, the first half of the book. Then it talks about how children interpret events, so that could apply to children. And then it gets in the end to how to do therapy with adults who were abused as children. Predators is a book that touches on all those topics, but mostly is focused on prevention. How to detect deception, how to realize you can't detect deception because it's deceptive, and then how to protect your kids in a practical, common sense kind of way. Not going too far, but not being gullible and naive and setting yourself up for problems. So all 3 of those books should be standard reading for anybody who wants to study sex offenders in any capacity. The word that stood out every time that she wrote it is betrayal. The betrayal of intimacy, the betrayal of children by adults, that children are brought into this world without any say in the matter, and then they are ruled over by the people who are bigger than them, who are more cognitively developed than them, that have all the institutional power, who have all the money, and then we betray them. That adults sexually abuse them, or physically or emotionally abuse them, and you would expect other adults to step in and protect those children. And we fail. We fail over and over again, whether it's family members who see the abuse and do nothing or blame the child, whether it's churches or school officials, and I could go on and on about that one, or sports or any type of organization. What about law enforcement? What about Children's Protective Services and all the immense failures of justice that occur because of inept investigations, or prosecutors who refuse to take a case that was referred to them by Children's Services, or that the plea deals that these people get to plead guilty to a non-sex crime or to a much lesser offense than what they actually committed, and then blame the child again and say, well, we didn't want to go to trial, we don't want to traumatize the kid, so we're just going to call the kid a prostitute and close the case. The list of reasons why our system fails children and then turns these people back out into society, often with no therapy at all. And when they do get therapy, there's no guarantee that it was the effective evidence-based kind. And the lack of accountability, the failure to continually evaluate and improve, is betrayal, the betrayal of children. And when that word shows up in her work every single time, it reminds me that I have to keep reading. That no matter how difficult the material is, it's up to it. One of the reasons these people are so deceptive and can avoid it is because most of us don't want to believe that people that could do something like this. Or we can't believe it because it doesn't fit within our own personal experiences. But we have to do it because they're living in that world and it's out there. So, betrayal. Now, one thing I want to talk about now is a complete change of tone, which is that Dr. Salter wrote several fiction books, mystery novels. And when I read these, I was amazed. I loved them. So I want to talk about them. She was interviewed by a newspaper in Wisconsin, and they asked her, "You write fiction and nonfiction. Which is most appealing to you?" And Dr. Salter said, "Fiction is more fun, because with nonfiction, you have to be excruciatingly careful that you're accurate about everything. Fiction is a great release, because you get to make things up, and the good guys always win. You mine some pretty dark territory in these books. Is there something therapeutic in that for you because of your line of work?" Dr. Salter said, "Yes, there certainly is. Some of the cases I get involved in are heartbreaking. I testify at a lot of court cases involving offenders. I do evaluations of sex offenders. I'm currently doing evaluations of extremely violent offenders, the ones who attack staff when they're incarcerated. All of this takes its toll. The hardest cases for me, the hardest cases are sadistic cases or torture cases. Yes, writing is a catharsis for me." I'm going to talk about her first 4 books, Shiny Water, Fault Lines, White Lies, and Prison Blues. And the main character in these books is a psychologist named Dr. Michael Stone. But it's a woman, so the name Michael is just sort of a quirk. So Dr. Stone is basically Anna Salter. Went to school, got a psychology degree, moves to Vermont in a mostly rural environment with real fancy suburbs, and works in a hospital where surgeons are doing lots of operations, and they make a lot of money. Now, this is not like an Andrew Vax kind of book where, the main character is an ex-con who works as a private detective and commits crimes and tracks down prostitutes in the seedy underbelly of New York City. This is a rural, hospital, wealthy Vermont setting. Surely there can't be much mystery and crime in a place like that. Surely she wouldn't write about sex abuse crimes. These books are actually her real-life cases that have been converted, de-identified, mixed together, a couple of fictional elements added in, so that she can talk about real-life cases of what happens when a surgeon sexually abuses his children. And he goes into the courtroom wearing a nice 3-piece suit, and he's got a very expensive attorney, and he can hire all the experts he wants, and his wife looks crazy. He can just say his wife is crazy. She made it all up. It's just false accusations, false memory syndrome. And she describes how excruciatingly difficult it is to get justice when the person who's raping children doesn't look like the typical child molester. You got to remember that there's no socioeconomic status. There's no profile of a typical sex offender. They are everywhere. And she knows this better than anyone else in the world because she interviewed them and she saw how they camouflage and the excuses they make and how they love to deceive and trap. And that's why these books are so important. But like Andrew Vack's books, these books are a Trojan horse. It is a thrilling mystery. It's a mystery that'll make you angry. You want to find out who did it. You want them to get justice. And you want this psychologist to go and be the one to get justice, not to just make a report to the police, but to, be the one that fits it all together. And behind it are real life cases of egregious failures of justice. And so it's a wake-up call. So the first book, Shiny Water, investigates a horrible situation of a typical family case where a father is accused of sexually abusing children. The mother's getting divorced. They say she's getting divorced because of the abuse, and even the mother doesn't believe the kids. But there's pretty good evidence that the kids were abused. And then it goes, you think that's bad, it gets worse from there. Worse and worse and worse. And it brings up a great point is because Anna Salter herself does go and interview people in prisons and is privy to information that most of us will never, ever be exposed to, that she kind of notices that it's kind of like a Silence of the Lambs thing, where you're going to a prison to talk to someone to kind of get insights in how a sadist thinks. And maybe he could give you some clues and help you. Well, isn't he your Hannibal Lecter? Aren't you? And so she makes a little joke about that. But there's one thing that happens with this is that the guy she goes to be her Hannibal Lecter, to get information on how sadists think when they torture children, is he found a loophole to be released from prison. And he might now want those notes that she took so that she doesn't use them against him someday. So now she's being hunted in fault lines. And I could go on and on about this and tell you the whole plot of every book. I loved these books. I thought they were great. A great supplement to anyone who's a fan of Andrew Vack's. But my favorite is Prison Blues, because I think Anna Salter is the only person who really understands the predation and the ongoing use of manipulation, conning, and deceiving that happens even in a prison environment. And I've interviewed a lot of correctional officers and prison inspectors and looked at cases where escapes were made from prison with the help of staff. And you think, why would staff do this? Why would staff get wrapped up and involved with these people in prison for horrible crimes, even rapists? And they fall in love and they want a sexual relationship with these people. How could they let this happen? Well, Dr. Michael Stone in that book is brought in as a substitute teacher for a sex offender therapy program because the previous therapist was fired. And then she has to find out why and what's going on and unravel a prison mystery, which is so rare that it's inspired me to write my own prison mystery. It's not finished yet, and I'm sure it won't be as good as hers. But anyway, these are 4 very good books, and I really wish she would have continued writing these, especially with the character Dr. Michael Stone. I want to read one quote from Shiny Water, though, and this will tell you that truth is stranger than fiction. And when you read something crazy in a book that's written by someone who has real practical experience, they're not a professional fiction author, that truth that's stranger than fiction is probably a real life thing that no one would believe. So I assume that this is true. This must have happened to her. But she could never write about this in one of her nonfiction books, so she got it out here. I had a client who showed up early one day while I was eating lunch. I told her to come on in and excuse myself to wash my hands. 3 years later, she got mad at me and came in one day and threw chicken bones in my face. I didn't even know what they were. She had stolen the chicken bones from my lunch and had frozen them to keep some part of me near her. Talk about boundaries issues. But my assumption is that that's a real thing. Nobody could make that up unless they had experienced it. Now, Andrew Vack's had written a lot of books about the trauma of sexual abuse, and I'm certain, but based on some of the passages in his books, that he had read things written by Anna Salter. He describes things too well, He obviously had met a lot of people who were abused in his own career, but it was interesting to me that she defended him in one of her books by saying that people who accuse him of writing sex thrillers had never read his books. He's writing about the trauma of sexual abuse and the horrors of real life abuse. And he wrote an endorsement of one of her books. He said, "It's more than just a crackling, suspenseful mystery. It is a war zone dispatch from a battle-scarred veteran ringing with power and truth." Once again, it's a Trojan horse of ideas of real-life issues put in a fictional format for the widest possible audience. Ironically, I think Anna Salter is the one person who writes in academia in such an accessible way that she doesn't need fiction to convey her ideas. But I do understand that people escape into fantasy and fiction and might not ever read Transforming Trauma. And so she's able to get those same concepts across in a fictional book and wake people up. Now, Andrew Vax wrote a book called Shella, and that's my favorite book by Andrew Vax. It's a standalone book about a man on the search for a woman whose name is Shella. And after I read that book, at the very end, it describes something really traumatic, like a horrible thing. And it made me really confused and sick and upset to read. And it took me a while to, realize that, well, Andrew Vax is a great storyteller. And I just assumed he made it up and that something like that could never happen. But Andrew Vax always had claimed that he was downplaying reality in his books. He was not making stuff up. If he wrote it, it could happen. And I thought about that with Shella because it describes cases of people committing murder, people killing someone and clawing their eyeball out with a can opener. He describes horrible crimes, and then he describes a racist compound of neo-Nazis and like all their ideology and radicalization and how they recruit people. And you realize that all of that is true. All of those things can and do happen. But the ending was so traumatic, and I can't tell you what it is, that I wondered, where did he get that from? Well, on page 271 of Anna Salter's book, Transforming Trauma, at the bottom of the page of the paperback edition, you will see one sentence that describes this event that I find so traumatic in Shella that I thought it must be fiction. And it turns out that it was an experience that one of Anna Salter's clients reported to her. So, truth is stranger than fiction, and truth is more traumatic than fiction could ever be. Anna Salter wrote one last book, a fiction book, called Truth Catcher, with a new psychologist as the protagonist, and her name's Breeze. And she has this thing where she's very sensitive to sound and she can see colors. And I happen to know somebody who claims that that's true for them, and I didn't believe them. It seems weird, like my brain can't imagine seeing a color when I hear a noise. And so I didn't believe that until I read this book, and I was like, is this real? So I looked it up, and apparently it is true. There are some people who are so sensitive to noise that their brain can create colors. Well, Anna Salter has a great idea. What if someone had that ability and they were tasked with doing risk assessments and detecting lies among people who are about to be released from prison? So let's say you're interviewing a sex offender, you do the static 99 and all these risk assessment tools, and he's about to be released, but he might be telling a lie about something. Could you detect lies by seeing these colors, a change in their voice? And it's an interesting idea. It only shows up in the book a couple times, but it plays an important role towards the end. And but what is very interesting in this book is Anna Salter moved to Wisconsin. And when she got there, she started working for the courts and Department of Corrections. She was a consultant. And she started writing, doing risk assessments and forensic interviews with people who are about to be released from prison, who might pose a danger to society, and they could potentially be locked up in a civil commitment. So put in a hospital or a setting where they can't get access to children. And frustratingly with these tools is, the tools are pretty good for some people. They don't, they're not 100% reliable. And some people skate by because they probably committed a lot of crimes, but they didn't get charged with a lot of crimes, and so that seriously reduces their risk score. Well, this character, Breeze, the psychologist, she might have a way of identifying other crimes this person did if she goes on an investigation like a private detective. So that's the mystery part of the book, and it's really good. But in there is more truth about Anna Salter and her career. And because that's always going to be more compelling reading than if you just make up a character from scratch. And she includes this couple of paragraphs here that describes why she stopped doing therapy with victims. And she said, this is the fictional character speaking, but I would imagine it has something to overlap with Anna Salter's real experiences. She said, I had nearly drowned in the well of misery that showed up on the hour every hour in a therapist's office. I reached the point where I couldn't listen to one more broken and battered child, not one more dissociative, depressed adult. I worried all the time about my self-mutilating, suicidal clients. I just felt too bad for people to survive as a therapist. Other people's feelings seemed almost as vivid as my own to me, and as hard to let go of. Whatever the reasons, dealing with conning and manipulation was easier for me than dealing with trauma and suffering. I couldn't fix conning, and I knew enough not to try. I had no real empathy for psychopaths and rapists and pedophiles, and that saved me. Most days I just watched, took notes, and wrote up my little reports that separated out the ones the law could keep off the streets from the ones it couldn't. Sometimes, just sometimes, those reports were enough to keep another child from being molested or another woman from being raped, and I figured that wasn't such a bad way to make a living. So there's something really profound in there, which is that not only has Anna Salter done an incredible contribution to the field in studying this and chronicling all the research that's been done, taking her own clinical experience and sharing that with the world so that other people can learn. So she's affecting offenders who might not recidivate because of her therapy. She's affecting children to recover from abuse, adults who can recover from their traumatic childhoods. She's influencing therapists, holding them to a high standard and training them how to do their job better. Isn't that enough for anybody? She's like a hero to everyone. And now she has a job where she helps keep people locked up by doing her job, very carefully doing a full clinical assessment and risk assessment of these people, presenting it to the court, and sometimes they get taken off the streets by incapacitating them further. And other times they are released. She is fulfilling a vital function in society by helping the system decide who stays behind bars and who gets set free. How many hundreds of crimes have been prevented because Anna Salter knows her job really well? And if all the rest of us could just be half as good at what we do as she is at what she does, maybe we could also contribute to the success of our civilization. Well, it all comes together in her recent book, just came out this year, 2025, called Confronting Malice, a memoir of working with sex and violent offenders. And in it, she describes giving testimony in court, talking about why some people are sadists, why they torture children to death for fun.
He is sadistic, and he is necrophiliac in the sense of his enjoyment of dismemberment. He had ties handy to bind her hands. He tried to throw off police by leaving the backpack in one place and a torso in another. When the police interviewed them, he told them about a suspicious person and a suspicious car. He also researched chloroform on the internet. He decided, when he was unsuccessful with the adult jogger, that he needed someone with a smaller body type.
In this book, she continues her arguments, taking the threads from all her previous work and revisiting them with up-to-date statistics and things. And she talks about, once again, the naivete in the system. There are plenty of other occasions when dangerous men and women are put on the street because somebody buys sorry. If they say they're sorry, well, our good nature tells us that they're really sorry, right? There is a large and interesting movement today to be kind to offenders, to treat them better, to rehabilitate them by helping them learn skills. I treat every single person I interview respectfully, but I am not naive enough to think that respect or kindness or skill training alone will turn the tide of malevolence in a violent offender that was built up through a lifetime of training and harboring grudges. It's going to be a lot more complicated than that. Good therapists walk on the knife edge, treating everyone with respect for their human potential while not minimizing the harmfulness of what they may have done or their potential for future harm. Many therapists fall off this knife edge, either becoming angry and demeaning toward the offenders they work with, or colluding and minimizing their behavior. There was a case where a man was found guilty of sexual abuse and then he was convicted, sent to prison. And then he tried to appeal his conviction on the grounds that his attorneys were ineffective at representing him. And primarily because they did not raise any objections to the testimony by the state's expert witness, Dr. Anna Salter. And he wanted them to say that she doesn't know what she's talking about, that she's, clearly not an expert. But the attorneys said she came in and testified concerning late disclosure, who you disclose to, those types of things. And without proper foundation may be objectionable, but we were aware that Dr. Salter could have given the necessary foundation, so we did not in any effect try to bolster her testimony by asking any foundational questions. Same thing as we did not ask her about her expertise, because we knew she had it. So we did not try to make her out to be better than she was, we just let her testify to those things. And the court said, all right, so she was an expert on sexual abuse, and from what you're telling me, Mr. Reedy, you agree that she was an expert on the topic? And the defense attorney said, I believe her credentials were exemplary. So the court ruled against the appeal and said, the PCR court found Reedy knew that Dr. Salter had the credentials to support her testimony and did not want to draw attention to the same in an effort to keep from bolstering her testimony. Imagine this, like everyone is scared to death of going to court, because the defense attorneys are so manipulative, aggressive, they're good at their job, that's what they do. It's like a boxing match, and they are the heavyweight champions. And you don't have experience. You're sitting there in the box, and you're the expert, and they ask you questions, and they attack your credibility. Where did you go to school? How do you know? What makes you qualified to say that? And a lot of people can't handle it. It's really stressful. I mean, it keeps you up at night. You always say to yourself, what should I have said differently? And Dr. Salter's an expert at this. She's done it so many times that she goes in, she's prepared, she's got the credentials, and she makes the defense attorneys sit down and shut up. That's incredible. I don't know if anyone else, can you imagine, it's the greatest testament to her abilities ever that defense attorneys are scared of her. Now, one thing I want to talk about is the Pollyanna worldview that people who are not victims have. Now, I mentioned that several times, where you kind of looking at the bright side of things. You don't want to believe that bad things happen. And if they do, maybe they happen for a reason. But don't worry, we'll get over it. And I personally see this a lot in my profession. I think that a lot of academics in the ivory tower who study criminology are out of touch with the trauma of these crimes. They spend a lot of time talking about the trauma of someone going to prison and being ostracized and stigmatized, and what it's like to have your name on a sex offender registry and why we should feel sorry for them. And that mentality, that when that's your starting position, that we shouldn't stigmatize or label people who rape children, you're probably not looking at the total scope of the issue. Now, there are some people who do that and they differentiate and they say there's a difference between the type of sex offender they're talking about versus the really bad ones. But there are some who are, in my opinion, so naive that they will take all the research done by people like Anna Salter, all the research done on psychopathy and sadism, and throw it in the trash because they hold it to such a high standard that no social science will ever prove to them that there are bad people in the world. However, they'll take a theory promoted by Foucault or Durkheim or someone, and they'll use that as scientific evidence. And one of the worst people who does this, in my opinion, is Shad Maruna, who was the former president of the American Society of Criminology. And he is very flippant in getting rid of any research that he doesn't like and just claiming that something is true when it's a polemic. It's an unfalsifiable claim about the public being foolish or how offenders really aren't that bad and deep down inside they're good people. But he did do some good work. You don't get to be the president of ASC by just being a polemicist. And one of the things he did is he wrote a book called Making Good, and it's about interviewing people in prison and how they develop a fatalistic worldview that if they think that they're a bad person, when they get out, they'll do it again. and that therapy could focus on that. And it's like, oh, that's a pretty good idea for a whole lot of people in prison. I mean, I would say that that would be instrumental in a lot of people's lives, trying to get them away from the mentality that they're an irredeemable criminal. So he uses the word redemption a lot, redemption scripts. I think the problem with this is that it does not take into account the fact that the majority of all crimes are committed by a small number of people. And the majority of sex crimes are committed by a small number of people. And those people have distinct characteristics about them that are going to be resistant to change. And being nice to them is not going to solve our problems. That's a big controversy in my profession, which is the social sciences. I study criminal justice, and he's a sociologist. And Anna Salter is a psychologist. Now, we have two conflicting views here. One is Shad Maruna, who says that the reason you believe psychopaths exist is because it's easy to believe that there are bad people. On the other hand, Dr. Salter says it's easy to deny that evil exists, because if you don't believe it exists, then you don't have to think about it and worry about it. So who's right? I'm going to play two clips for you, and you decide for yourself.
Student named Martins, where he's empirically supported Ellard's hypothesis here that people are far more frightened and disturbed by a notion like Hannah Arendt's banality of evil or situational explanations that any one of us could commit deeply evil acts in the right circumstances than we are with the idea of monsters among us. That is, it's easier for us to think about monsters, evil beings, or indeed psychopaths committing evil acts than it is to consider the fact that anyone could commit those acts in the wrong circumstances. It's deeply comforting to us because it allows us to consign the evil in the world to a particular species and one to which we have no particular connection.
It's easier to deny malevolence than it is to face it. But we have no hope of detecting and stopping this kind of behavior if we don't learn something about it. I made this film in the hopes that the next victim won't report 6 or 7 times as Gerald's victim did and still not be believed.
Now, I specifically chose Shad Maruna for this comparison when there are many other sociologists who make the same claims, because Anna Salter wrote 3 or 4 pages of her memoir about Shad Maruna's book and said that it's very important for us to consider that giving people a chance and helping them and facilitating their success is very important, and treating everyone with respect. So it shows that she's not into platitudes. She's not a one-dimensional thinker. She doesn't throw out studies that don't conform to what she sees in her practice, which she probably sees the worst of the worst. She knows there's a whole lot of people out there who don't belong in that category of the worst of the worst, by definition. But she doesn't throw out other people's work. I just wish Shad Maruna didn't throw out all the research on psychopathy because it's inconvenient for his philosophy. Now, I'm not going to get into that. Like I said, she said nice things about Shad Maruna. She is not saying any criticism of him at all. That's me. But I do want to say that she's made so many noteworthy contributions. I hope that this summary of her work has pointed you in the right direction on some of that. But here's a couple things I want to emphasize again. Number one is she pushes back against false narratives, especially about children with false memories, or if children are lying, coerced by their mothers, or the abuse was the mother's fault. She pushes back against that, and that is necessary in the social sciences to take us to the next level. We can't keep believing the same stuff over and over just because other people said it, just because Sigmund Freud said it. He was wrong. Okay, let's move forward. The second one is describing the varied response of victims to sexual abuse and the devastating trauma that can happen from abuse. So some victims have amnesia about it. They don't report it and don't want to believe it, even if the guy confesses. Other people dissociate and they've blocked it out. Other people distract themselves and they're so busy that it looks like they're a really high-functioning person, but really, if they slow down, all the trauma is going to come out. Depression, anxiety, suicide, drug use, the affective flashbacks. She brought out all these different ways people respond. And if you were try to say this kid wasn't abused because they're not behaving the way that most victims act, That's the most foolish thing I've ever heard, and she's the first person to point that out. Establishing the importance of conducting therapy with offenders and victims, but to do it separately. So once again, the idea that someone can be a sex offender treatment provider, of whom I've met many in my career, and they work in a prison, and they provide therapy, and they're talking to these guys, and they believe every word they say. What if you go and interview the victims and get their side of it? Don't you think that would be interesting, that would help you see that where this guy manipulates and downplays and blames the victim, and that would help you as a therapist? But we still don't do that very often. Application of research on psychopathy and sadism in clinical settings, and especially teaching people about deception, bringing that information, that research to the public. Bringing out the words of child abusers to the public with her DVDs that are now on YouTube, to the public without interference by a middleman. And then lastly, holding the profession to a high standard of accountability. Treatment works. Okay, what do you mean? Treatment plus relapse prevention, plus hormone therapy, plus all these other programs and employment and being on probation and supervised closely and not allowed to live with kids and reducing opportunities. What do you mean treatment works? Well, this program, what standard do you have? What type of therapy did you provide? Is this program even based on evidence? How often do you evaluate? She holds everyone to a high standard because she understands the cost, what's at stake here. She has skin in the game. She understands this, whereas a lot of academics, I feel like, are out of touch. So I'll always respect her for those things there. Any one of those would have been a great contribution to the literature, and she did them all.
Nobody wants to be traumatized. Nobody wants to be a victim. People don't understand that. They expect all victims to have the same reaction to sexual assault. People expect that every victim will run screaming from the room, assuming she's conscious, and that they will hate the guy forever and never have any contact with that person again. It is normal for victims to answer a text or to see him again. They can't wrap their minds around what happened. But people don't understand that. What happens to you when you fall down in public? Okay? We all scramble up. I'm fine. No, I don't need any help. No, I'm not hurt. Why didn't we do that? We didn't do anything wrong. We just fell down. But we are programmed not to make a scene.
Nowadays, Anna Salter is, I don't believe she's fully retired, but she does work on a sanctuary for horses for equine-assisted therapy. So horses need therapy, humans need therapy. Let's all get together and ride a horse. And I feel like she talks about this in her book, but also she has a website for the Middle Way Sanctuary. And I feel like this is a great way for her to enjoy life and get that peace and quiet that everyone dreams of after a lifetime of dealing with the worst cases of abuse and trauma. Can you imagine if she had stuck with, back in 1977, she's focused on hyperactivity among students in elementary schools? She would have done great. She's very smart. She would have helped contribute to our understanding of ADHD and medicine and school, but she wouldn't have studied horrible, traumatic sexual abuse of children. And as a result, we would probably still be trusting those lunatics who thought that the victim was to blame, or those people who were using ineffective therapy but weren't held to a high standard of evaluating it. And so, even though I'm sure that what she put herself through to meet those victims, to see the injustice and to feel that pain, must have been a great sacrifice for her, she has probably had a greater impact on making the world a better place than anyone else I know of in the social sciences.